engine of her car faded down the driveway before I even realized what was happening. I stood in the kitchen of my own house, the one I had lived in for 31 years, and I watched the red taillights disappear around the corner of Birchwood Crescent. My daughter had said she was just popping out to get milk. She'd taken my purse with her. She'd taken my phone. She'd taken the spare key I kept on the hook by the back door. She did not come back. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. My daughter is not a monster in the way that word usually gets used. She didn't grow up hard. She didn't have a difficult childhood. I made sure of that. I worked 30 years as a registered nurse at St. Need, Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, double shifts when I had to, weekend rotations, every holiday rotation they'd give me because the overtime paid better. I did that so she could have piano lessons and ski trips to Tremblant and the used car when she turned 17 that ran better than anything I'd driven until I was 35. I did that because she was mine and I loved her, and I thought love meant you gave everything you had. I was 64 years old when I found out what love had actually bought me. My name is Margaret. Most people call me Peggy. I retired from nursing 3 years before any of this happened, took my pension, sold the house in Hamilton, and moved to a smaller place in Guelph to be closer to my daughter Claire and her husband Derek. That was the first mistake, though I didn't know it then. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought being nearby meant being loved. Claire is 41, Derek is 43. He sells commercial real estate and has the kind of confidence that fills a room whether or not anyone has asked it to. From the beginning, I never completely trusted him, but I pushed that feeling down the way you do when someone is your daughter's husband and you don't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. I smiled at Christmas dinners. I babysat their dog when they went to Muskoka. I lent Claire $2,000 when their furnace needed replacing, and then another $1,500 when Derek's truck needed work, and then small amounts so many times I stopped counting because counting felt ungracious. I didn't count until later, when I had nothing else to do but count. The life insurance policy was Claire's idea, or at least that's how it was presented to me. She sat with me at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in March with a cup of tea she'd made herself and a folder of papers, and she explained that it was just practical. I was 64, I lived alone, and if something happened to me, wouldn't it be better if things were sorted out properly? She said it gently. She said it like she was doing me a favor. She named herself as a sole beneficiary, and I signed the papers because she was sitting right there, and she was my daughter, and I thought, yes, this is just being practical. The policy was for $400,000. I found this out later from a different source. The number she told me that afternoon was not the real number. That spring and into the summer, I noticed small changes. Derek started coming to family dinners more than usual, which he never used to do. He would ask questions about my finances in ways that seemed casual but weren't. How was the pension holding up? Had I looked at any financial advisors lately? Had I thought about whether the house was too much maintenance for one person? I answered honestly because I had nothing to hide. My pension from the Ontario Nurses Association was solid. I had savings in a TFSA and an RRSP I hadn't touched. I owned the house outright. Claire started calling more often too. But the calls felt different. She'd ask the same questions in different ways. Who did I have listed as my emergency contact at the doctor's office? Had I updated my will recently? Did I still have the same financial advisor or had I switched? I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that right up until the evening in late September when Claire came over for dinner alone, without Derek for once, and she seemed almost like her old self. Warm. Relaxed. She helped me wash up after, and she asked if I wanted to take a drive the next morning, just the two of us, up toward the Niagara Escarpment. She said she'd found a trail she thought I'd love, not too long, not too hard, just beautiful. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I miss who I was in that moment. 64 years old, and still believing my daughter wanted to take a walk with me because she loved me? We drove out the next morning. It was a cool October day, that particular kind of Ontario fall where the sky is completely clear and the maples are red and gold and everything looks like a postcard. She'd brought a thermos of coffee and we talked in the car about nothing in particular, normal things, her neighbor's new fence, whether I'd watched anything good lately. It felt like something I had wanted for years without knowing how to ask for it. She parked on a gravel pull-off near a trail entrance I didn't recognize, somewhere past Rockwood, deeper into the greenbelt than I'd expected. She said the trailhead was just through the tree line and the view from the ridge was worth it. Derek was already there. He was standing at the trailhead with his hands in his jacket pockets and he smiled when he saw me. That broad realtor smile that never quite reaches his eyes. I remember feeling the first cold shift in my stomach then, but I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd driven separately. Maybe this was meant to be a family outing. We walked into the woods together. I asked twice which direction the trail went. Neither of them answered directly. After about 20 minutes, we reached a flat rock near a steep drop in the trail that looked down into a ravine. The view was beautiful. I said so. Claire said something about how she needed to get back to the car. She'd forgotten something, and before I had processed the sentence, she was already walking back the way we came. I turned to Derek and he said he was heading back too, that I should take my time, enjoy the view. They were both gone before I understood what was happening. I didn't have my phone. Claire had offered to carry my bag from the car and I had let her, because that is the kind of thing daughters do for their mothers. I called out. The trees gave nothing back. I don't know how long I stood on that rock before I moved. Long enough for the cold to settle into my hands and for the light to start shifting. I was wearing a fleece jacket, walking shoes, and jeans. No water. No food. I had my reading glasses in my jacket pocket and a partial roll of peppermints. I want to tell you that I was calm. I wasn't. I was 64 years old and I was alone in the woods somewhere east of Guelph and my daughter had just walked away from me and I sat down on that flat rock and I shook. I let myself do that for a few minutes. I cried. I'm not ashamed to say that. Then I stopped. I had spent 30 years as a nurse. I had seen people survive things that should have ended them. I had held the hands of people in their final hours, and I had watched other people pull themselves back from the edge of those same hours through nothing more than stubbornness and the refusal to give up. I was cold and I was terrified and I was grieving something I couldn't name yet, but I was not dying in those woods if I had any say in it. I found the ridge. I followed it because ridges follow water and water follows roads. I had read that somewhere, years ago, and I held onto it like a fact. My walking shoes were not made for uneven ground and I twisted my left ankle within the first half hour, not badly, but enough to slow me down. I used a fallen branch as a stick. I kept moving. I found a creek after what I think was 2 hours. I followed it downhill. The light was going. I was genuinely frightened of what the night would mean, temperature-wise, because that is a rational fear in October in Ontario, and I was old enough not to pretend otherwise. I kept walking. The sound of the highway reached me before I could see it, that particular low hum of traffic, steady and mechanical, and the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I came out through a ditch onto the shoulder of a 2-lane highway I didn't know. I was filthy. My ankle ached. I had eaten all the peppermints. A truck pulled over within minutes. The driver was a man in his 50s with a high-visibility vest over his jacket and the practiced calm of someone who had seen things on roadsides before. He didn't ask me a single probing question. He said, "Are you all right?" And when I said no, he said, "Okay, get in." He had a water bottle in his console and he handed it to me without being asked. I drank the whole thing. He drove me to a Tim Hortons in Rockwood and asked if there was someone I could call. I told him there wasn't. I told him that and he looked at me for a moment and then he said, "Do you need the police?" And I said yes. Then he went inside and bought me a large coffee and a sandwich and he sat with me until the OPP arrived. I think about him sometimes. I never got his name. He gave me the first hour of my new life, and he didn't ask for a single thing in return. The officer who took my statement was thorough and kind. I told her everything. She drove me to Guelph General, where they checked my ankle, treated some scrapes on my hands, and gave me dry socks from somewhere, which I have not forgotten. A social worker came and helped me make a few calls. The hospital was able to confirm my identity through my OHIP card, which I kept in my jacket pocket out of 30 years of professional habit. Every nurse I know does this. I never thought about why until that night. They sent a constable to my house. Claire and Derek were home. The constable later told me that Claire had seemed surprised. That was the word he used, surprised. I stayed with a former nursing colleague, a woman named Barb who had retired to Guelph 2 years before I did, and who, when I called her from the hospital, said only, "I'm coming right now," and meant it exactly. I slept in her guest room for 3 nights. I ate food she made. I drank more tea than I had drunk in years. I let myself be taken care of by someone who actually meant to take care of me. On the second day, I called my bank, CIBC. I had a checking account, a TFSA, and an RRSP, and I needed to know what was in them. The checking account had been accessed twice since the morning I went into the woods. Combined, just over $6,000 had been withdrawn. Claire had my debit card, which had been in my purse. She knew my PIN because I had told it to her 2 years ago during a medical scare I'd had, when I thought I might need surgery and I wanted her to be able to access funds if she needed to. I had trusted her with that number because she was my daughter, and I was afraid. The fraud department flagged the transactions when I reported them. My account was frozen and then secured. The $6,000 was eventually recovered. On the third day, I called the insurance company. The policy Claire had arranged for me. I wanted to know its exact terms. The agent confirmed the face value was $400,000, as I had suspected. She also confirmed that a claim had not yet been filed. I was not legally dead. Reporting myself as alive, with the OPP case number the officer had given me, meant that any claim filed using fraudulent information would constitute insurance fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada. The agent connected me to their fraud investigation unit before I had finished my sentence. I won't pretend I wasn't angry. I was furious in a way I hadn't felt since I was young, the kind of anger that is clean and cold and completely focused. But I had worked in healthcare for 30 years. I understood documentation. I understood process. I understood that emotion without evidence is just noise, and what I needed to make was not noise. I asked Barb to drive me to a lawyer's office that same afternoon. I chose a family and estate law firm on Willett Street based on reviews I read on my phone, which Barb had lent me, one of those older iPhone models she kept as a spare. The lawyer I met was a woman in her late 40s who listened to me for 50 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she said, "We have quite a bit to work with here." We did. The OPP investigation moved methodically. The criminal charges that followed were not quick, because the law is not quick, and I want to be honest about that. There were weeks of waiting. There were weeks of paperwork and statements and conversations with investigators who asked the same questions in different orders to make sure my answers stayed consistent, which they did, because I was telling the truth. I moved back into my house in November with a locksmith and a new deadbolt and an alarm system that Barb helped me choose. I am not going to tell you those months were easy. I had nights where I lay awake running the conversations backward, looking for the moment I should have seen it coming. The afternoon she'd explained the policy to me, the way Derek had started asking about my finances. The morning she'd suggested the walk. The red taillights disappearing around the corner of Birchwood Crescent. I replayed all of it. I probably always will. But I also had mornings. And they got better. The trial was held the following spring at the Ontario Court of Justice in Guelph. I sat in that courtroom on the first day and I watched Claire and Derek walk in. Claire looked at me once and then looked away. Derek stared straight ahead the entire time. That same fixed expression he'd been wearing since the night the constable showed up at their door. The Crown prosecutor laid out the case with the kind of quiet precision that I had come to understand over those months was actually quite devastating. The insurance policy and its face value. The bank withdrawals in the 2 days following. The text messages recovered from Claire's phone between her and Derek, from the weeks before. Messages about timelines, about what to do after, about the money, the trail of evidence that they had apparently believed would never be read in a courtroom. I testified. I described the drive, the trail, the rock, the sound of the engine fading. I described following the creek in the dark. I described the truck driver who stopped on the highway without asking why I was standing there. I spoke clearly and I did not cry. Not because I was performing strength, but because I was past the part of this that made me cry. What I felt sitting in that witness box was something harder and quieter, a kind of settling. Claire received a sentence of 4 years. Derek received 5, given the evidence that the original plan had largely originated with him. The financial fraud charges ran concurrent with the charges of criminal negligence causing bodily harm and the attempted insurance fraud. My lawyer walked me through every count. Outside the courthouse, in the thin spring sunlight, Barb was waiting on the steps with 2 cups of coffee from the Tim Hortons across the street. She handed me one, and we stood there for a while without saying much. Someone asked me afterward whether I had forgiven them. I thought about the question honestly, the way I think it deserves to be thought about. I thought about Claire at 6 years old with chickenpox, asking me to stay until she fell asleep, and I stayed. I thought about her at 17, learning to parallel park in the hospital lot on Sunday mornings because the lot was empty. I thought about everything I had given and every reason I had given it. Then I thought about the rock overlooking the ravine, the sound of footsteps walking away, the October dark coming down through the trees. Forgiveness is something people offer when someone is sorry. Neither of them, not once, said they were sorry. What they said, through their lawyers, was that things had been misunderstood. That was the word, misunderstood. I am 65 years old now. I live in my house on Birchwood Crescent. My ankle is completely fine. I have a new phone, a new deadbolt, and a savings account I check every Monday morning because the habit makes me feel steady. Barb comes for dinner on Thursdays. I have started volunteering twice a week at the Guelph General because hospitals are the place I understand best and because sitting still has never suited me. I have not forgiven them. I have also not let them take anything else from me. Those 2 things I have learned can exist at exactly the same time. The coffee that morning on the courthouse steps was the best I had ever tasted. I finished every drop. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in after everything is done. Not the quiet of peace exactly, more like the quiet of a room after a long storm. The windows stop rattling. You look around at what's still standing. I think about the choices that brought each of us to that courtroom in Guelph. Not just Claire's choices, or Derek's, mine too. Every time I handed over money without asking when it would come back. Every time I felt something was off and told myself I was being difficult. Every time I loved in a way that didn't ask to be treated with basic decency in return. None of that made what they did right. But I can see now how a long chain of small decisions by all of us built the situation we ended up in. That's the thing about consequences. They rarely arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly, the way ice builds on a roof through a long winter. You don't notice it until the weight becomes too much. What saved me in the end wasn't luck. It was the fact that I still had my mind when they thought fear and cold and isolation would take it from me. I had spent 3 decades learning how to stay calm in rooms where people were at their most frightened and vulnerable. I used every bit of that in those woods, when my hands were shaking on that flat rock above the ravine. Something in me knew. Panic is a decision, and I was not going to make it. I followed the ridge. I followed the creek. I kept moving because stopping was the only thing I genuinely could not afford to do. I've thought about what I want people to take from my story. And I keep coming back to 3 things that I believe, in my bones, are what carried me through. The first is integrity. Not as a concept, but as a daily practice. Derek and Claire built their plan on the assumption that I was someone who could be discarded. They were wrong, and part of why they were wrong is that I had spent my life building a record of being someone people could rely on. The OPP officer believed me. The bank fraud department moved quickly. The lawyer said we had quite a bit to work with. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because you've lived in a way that leaves a trail of credibility behind you. The second is clear. Thinking under pressure. I didn't have a plan when I came out of those woods. What I had was the ability to slow down, assess what I actually had available to me. An hype card in my pocket, a nursing colleague's phone number I still had memorized, a fraud department line I knew how to reach, and move through each step methodically. Intelligence isn't about having all the answers before the problem arrives. It's about being able to think when everything around you has gone wrong. The third is the refusal to stop. Not stubbornness for its own sake. I've seen that do as much damage as giving up. I mean the specific kind of endurance that comes from knowing your own value clearly enough that no one else's cruelty can permanently convince you otherwise. Claire and Derek were counting on me to feel too old, too humiliated, too broken to fight back. They were wrong about that too. I'm 65 now. I check my bank account every Monday morning. I have dinner with Barb on Thursdays. I volunteer at the hospital on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I know every nurse on the floor by name within 2 weeks. I am still here. That, in the end, is the whole story.